I thought marriage was forever, a promise of love, trust, and loyalty. But my world shattered when I discovered my husband's darkest secret, a second family hidden from me for years. The lies, the deceit, it all makes sense now, but at the time I was blinded by love. As I look back on my marriage, I'm still trying to process the extent of the trauma I endured. We presented a perfect facade to the world. The beautiful home, the two-car garage, the vacations to exotic destinations. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. My husband and I would argue in hushed tones, making sure not to disturb our sleeping children. I'd cry myself to sleep at night, wondering what was wrong with me that I couldn't make our marriage work. Our social media feeds were filled with happy couple photos, but the truth was, we barely spoke to each other. The silence between us grew louder than any argument ever could. I remember one particularly poignant moment, my husband's 40th birthday party. We were surrounded by friends and family, laughing and smiling. But as the night wore on, he turned to me and whispered, "I'm so sorry." Sorry for what? I thought. For what was happening between us. For the love we had lost. I didn't know then, but I do now. As the facade crumbled around me, I saw my husband in a different light. The man who had once held my hand through every step, who had promised to love and cherish me forever, was now revealed to be a master manipulator. His charming smile, his convincing lies, all designed to keep me blind to the truth. But it's what happened next that still haunts me. I stumbled upon an old email on our shared computer, a forgotten conversation from years ago. My heart sank as I read the words, "Mom and Dad are coming over for dinner." Mom and Dad. Who were these people? The answers came flooding back like a tidal wave. His secret family, living just miles away from us. I felt like I was drowning in my own tears, unable to catch my breath. How could he keep this from me? For how long? And what else had he lied about? My world was shattered, and it would take years of therapy and self-discovery to pick up the pieces. As I sat in therapy sessions, trying to process everything that had happened, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. My husband's infidelity wasn't just about the physical act. It was about control, manipulation, and gaslighting. He would make me question my own memories, my feelings, and even my sanity. "You're overreacting," he'd say, "or this is all in your head." I started to doubt myself, wondering if maybe I had somehow contributed to his behavior. As I navigated the wreckage of my marriage, I started to realize that some of the people closest to me were actually part of the problem. My friends who would often say things like, "He's just stressed" or "He's going through a tough time," were enabling him. They'd make excuses for his behavior, and even question my own perceptions. I remember one friend in particular, Sarah, who would constantly tell me to be more understanding of my husband's needs. She'd say things like, "You know he loves you. Why can't you just forgive him?" Forgiveness was what they were selling me on, but it wasn't forgiveness that he needed. It was accountability. And I was starting to realize that these friends weren't actually supporting me at all, but rather protecting the status quo of our toxic relationship. As I began to distance myself from them, I started to feel a sense of freedom. It was like shedding layers of skin that had been suffocating me for years. But it wasn't easy. There were times when I doubted my decision, wondering if maybe I was being too harsh. That's when the self-doubt crept in. As I navigated this emotional minefield, I couldn't help but wonder if I was being too hard on him. The anger still simmered just below the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. But alongside that fury, a deep sadness had taken hold. It was like a heavy fog had rolled in, shrouding everything in its path. I'd find myself crying uncontrollably for no reason, or laughing through tears because it all seemed so absurd. I remember walking into the kitchen one morning to make breakfast, only to be hit with the memory of him making pancakes for our kids on a Sunday morning just like this one. The pang of loss and longing was almost too much to bear. And then there were the moments of guilt, wondering if I'd been too quick to judge him, or if maybe I should have given him another chance. These emotions swirled together in a toxic stew, making it hard for me to breathe, let alone think straight. It felt like I was trapped in some kind of emotional Groundhog Day, reliving the same painful memories over and over again. As I looked back on the wreckage of my marriage, I realized that I'd been trapped in a toxic cycle of behavior. Not just with my ex, but within myself too. I'd learned to people please, to apologize for being me, and to make excuses for his hurtful actions. It was like I was stuck in some kind of emotional Groundhog Day, reliving the same painful memories over and over again. But something inside me finally snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. The constant self-doubt, the anxiety that came with wondering what he'd say or do next, the feeling of being a fragile, breakable thing. It was time to break free from these toxic patterns. So, I started small, journaling about my feelings, identifying the triggers that set me off, and slowly but surely, I began to challenge those behaviors. I remember writing down all the times I'd apologize for something that wasn't even my fault. The guilt trips he'd put me on, the way I'd internalized his criticism as my own worthlessness. It was a painful process, but it was also liberating. For the first time in years, I started to see myself, not just through his eyes, but through mine. As I began to rebuild myself, I had to confront a harsh reality. My self-worth was in tatters. The constant belittling, the gaslighting, the manipulation, it had all taken its toll. I felt like a shadow of my former self, lost and uncertain about who I was outside of that toxic relationship. But something inside me refused to give up. I started small, writing down 3 things I liked about myself each day. It sounds silly now, but it was a radical act of self-love in the midst of such darkness. I'd scribble those affirmations on sticky notes and plaster them around my apartment, reminding myself that I deserved to be loved and respected, not just tolerated. And then came therapy, the safe space where I could finally unburden myself of all the pain and guilt. My therapist would say, "You did what you had to do to survive." Those words became my mantra. I began to see that I wasn't broken. I was strong. I was resilient. And slowly but surely, I started to rebuild. The darkness was suffocating me, like a heavy blanket that I couldn't shake off. Every waking moment felt like a battle to breathe, to exist. The memories of our marriage haunted me. The fights, the lies, the broken promises. I'd replay them over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it all. Why did he do this? What did I do wrong? The guilt was eating away at me, like acid on skin. As I began to rebuild my life outside the toxic walls of that marriage, I realized something crucial. I couldn't do it alone. The isolation was suffocating me, making every decision a Herculean task. I started attending support groups for survivors of emotional abuse. The first meeting was like a breath of fresh air. Finally, people who understood what I'd been through. We shared stories, tears, and laughter. It was like finding long-lost sisters. I also started volunteering at a local women's shelter. There, I met women who were in even worse situations than mine. Their strength and resilience inspired me to keep moving forward. For the first time in years, I felt seen, heard, and validated. These new connections became my lifeline. We'd meet for coffee, go on walks, or simply talk on the phone. It was freedom. My partner, Rachel, would say things like, "You're strong enough to get through this," or "I'm here with you every step of the way." It was a gentle reminder that I wasn't alone in this journey. These relationships gave me the courage to confront my past, to face the trauma head-on. They reminded me that healing is possible, and it's okay not to be okay. But it's also about finding people who will hold space for you when you're broken. Learning to forgive isn't about erasing the pain or excusing the hurtful actions of your ex. It's not about going back to the way things were before. Forgiveness is about releasing the grip of resentment, letting go of the anger and bitterness that consumed you for so long. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened. That's a crucial distinction. I've seen women forgive their abusers, only to find themselves trapped in a cycle of codependency all over again. For me, forgiveness was about understanding the root cause of my ex-husband's behavior, the trauma he experienced as a child that led him to become an addict and eventually an abuser. It wasn't about excusing his actions or justifying them. It was about recognizing the humanity in him, flaws and all. When I finally forgave him, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The process of forgiveness is messy, imperfect, and takes time. But it's also liberating. Rebuilding trust with others is a daunting task, especially after the wounds of a traumatic marriage. But I've come to realize that it's not just about rebuilding trust with my ex or even my loved ones. It's about learning to trust myself again. It wasn't until I started doing things on my own that I realized I'd been living someone else's dream for far too long. Every decision, every move had been made with the thought of keeping this marriage afloat. But as I began to step out of that toxic dynamic, something miraculous happened. I started to discover who I was outside of it. I remember taking up painting again, just like I used to in college. The smell of oil paints and turpentine brought back memories of my carefree days before the marriage, but this time, there was a sense of freedom that came with creating something new. It wasn't about pleasing anyone else, it was just about bringing a smile to my face. As I explored new hobbies, old passions rekindled, and I started to see myself in a different light. The woman I'd been trying so hard to please others, the wife who'd sacrificed her own identity for the sake of marriage, she began to fade away. In her place emerged a person I didn't know, but was slowly coming to love. As I navigated those early days of recovery, it was like being a plant that had been watered with poison for years. My growth was stunted, my petals wilting under the weight of trauma. But slowly, I began to recognize the importance of self-care in my healing process. I started by practicing self-love, not just as an ideal, but as a necessary act. I'd wake up every morning and say 3 affirmations out loud. I am enough, I am worthy, and I am loved. It sounds silly now, but at the time, it was like a lifeline to my battered soul. I'll never forget the first holiday season after I left my toxic marriage. It was like walking through a minefield. Every step felt precarious. Family gatherings were especially tough. My husband's family would still be there, pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. They'd ask me about the kids as if they didn't know what had been happening behind closed doors. I tried to put on a brave face, but inside, I was screaming. One year, my mother-in-law even had the nerve to say, "You're so lucky to have a husband who loves you." Lucky? Are you kidding me? I learned that it's essential to set boundaries during these times. It means saying no to certain events or conversations. It means having an exit strategy. For me, that meant leaving early and finding a safe space to collect myself. I'd go for a walk, call a trusted friend, or write in my journal. It was okay to prioritize my own emotional well-being. And it's funny, the more I took care of myself, the more resilient I became. It's not about avoiding these situations entirely. It's about facing them with a plan and support. That way, you can navigate the holidays and milestone events without getting consumed by the trauma. As you begin to rebuild your life after a traumatic marriage, one of the most challenging aspects is dealing with external judgment and criticism. It's like walking through a storm, where every step feels like a test of your worth. I remember when my ex-husband's family would whisper behind closed doors about me being unsuitable for their son. The whispers turned to outright criticism at family gatherings, making it hard for me to keep my head held high. People who don't understand what you've been through often make assumptions and offer unsolicited advice. They might say things like, "Just try to be more understanding," or "Why are you being so dramatic?" But here's the thing. Their words can pierce your soul like a knife. It's essential to remember that their opinions don't define your worth. You were once in a relationship with someone who chose to deceive and hurt you. Now, it's time to focus on healing and self-love. As I learned to stand up for myself and assert my boundaries, the external noise began to fade. I started to see that people who genuinely cared about me stood by my side, supporting me through the darkest of times. As I reflect on those tumultuous months, I realize that journaling was a lifeline for me. It's hard to put into words just how much writing down my thoughts and emotions helped me process the trauma. But one entry in particular stands out. It was a raw, unfiltered rant about the toxic dynamics we had created. I wrote about the gaslighting, the manipulation, the way he'd make me question my own sanity. It felt like a weight was being lifted off my shoulders as I poured everything onto those pages. As I sat on my couch, journaling away the memories of our toxic marriage, I knew that writing wasn't just a therapeutic outlet. It was a cry for help. The tears streaming down my face were more than just sadness. They were a manifestation of the pain I'd been carrying around for years. Writing about every argument, every betrayal, and every feeling of suffocation helped me process the trauma. But it also made me realize that I couldn't do this alone. That's when I knew it was time to reach out. I called my best friend, who had been a rock throughout our marriage, and broke down in tears on her phone. She listened patiently as I poured out every secret, every doubt, and every fear. Her words of encouragement were just what I needed. You don't have to do this by yourself. You're not alone. And with that conversation, the floodgates opened, and I began to accept help. It was a turning point in my recovery journey, one that marked the beginning of healing, growth, and rediscovery. As I stood at that turning point in my recovery journey, one that marked the beginning of healing, growth, and rediscovery, I knew forgiveness was key. But what does forgiveness really mean? Is it about letting go completely, or learning to live with the consequences of someone else's actions? For me, forgiveness meant acknowledging the pain my ex-husband caused, but also recognizing that his betrayal didn't define me. I remember poring over our marriage counseling sessions, searching for clues as to why he had lied and cheated. The more I reflected on those conversations, the more I realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing or justifying his behavior. It was about releasing myself from the burden of holding on to resentment and anger. Forgiveness, in my experience, isn't a one-time event. It's a process. And like any journey, there are ups and downs. Some days, forgiveness feels like a weight lifted off my shoulders, while others I'm still grappling with the what-ifs and maybes. But I've come to understand that forgiveness is not for him. It's for me. It's about breaking free from the toxic cycle of anger and hurt, and finding peace in the present. Rebuilding love after a traumatic marriage is not just about healing from the wounds inflicted by someone else. It's also about learning to trust yourself again. For me, that meant taking small steps toward self-love. I started by doing things that brought me joy, like painting and cooking. It sounds silly, but putting on makeup every morning felt like a revolutionary act after years of neglecting my appearance. I remember the first time I went out with friends without feeling anxious about what they might think or say. The freedom was exhilarating. But it wasn't just about external validation. It was also about learning to be kind to myself when I made mistakes or didn't meet unrealistic expectations. Practicing self-compassion helped me rebuild my sense of worth, one tiny step at a time. It's not always easy, and there are still days when the old patterns creep back in. But with each passing day, I feel more like myself, more whole, more confident. And that's what it's all about, finding peace in the present rather than dwelling on the past. As I look back on those dark days, I realize that the journey from victim to survivor was nothing short of a rebirth. It's like shedding skin that no longer serves you, but it's not easy. The weight of shame, guilt, and self-blame can be crushing. But slowly, I began to see that I wasn't the one who'd failed. The system had failed me. The toxic marriage, the lies, the manipulation. It was all a carefully crafted web to keep me trapped. And for so long, I bought into it. I internalized the shame and self-doubt. But something inside of me shifted when I started to speak out against my ex's abuse. It was like a dam broke, and suddenly, I was free to express myself without fear of reprisal. The first time I stood up for myself, I felt this surge of adrenaline. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. But it was also empowering. For the first time in years, I felt like I had agency over my life. And that's when the real work began, claiming my power back from the ashes of trauma. As I looked around at the people who loved me, I knew that rebuilding relationships would be just as daunting a task as healing myself. My husband had been my entire support system for years, but now he was gone. Or so I thought. I began to realize that reconnecting with others wouldn't be about replacing what we'd lost, but about finding new meaning and purpose in the connections we still had. As I looked back on the fragments of my shattered marriage, I realized that what was missing wasn't just the love we once shared, but a sense of gratitude for what we had. Gratitude is more than just saying thank you. It's about acknowledging the good in our lives and letting go of the pain. For me, it started with small things. Watching my kids laugh together, feeling the warmth of a sunny day, or even enjoying a quiet cup of coffee alone. These moments may seem insignificant on their own, but collectively they shifted my focus from what I'd lost to what I still had. I remember one particularly tough day when I found myself stuck in tears, replaying every argument and hurtful word. But then I looked at the photo album on my mantle, filled with memories of my children's birthdays, our family vacations, and countless moments that defined our love story. It was a painful reminder that even amidst trauma, there were moments of joy. And in that instant, something shifted inside me. I began to see that gratitude wasn't about erasing the past, but about finding strength in it. By focusing on what we still have rather than what's been lost, we can begin to heal and rebuild our lives anew. As I look back on the journey from that toxic marriage to where I am today, I see a woman who's been broken, battered, but ultimately remade. The key takeaways for me have been patience and self-love. It's easy to get caught up in trying to fix what's been shattered, but we can't rush the healing process. We have to allow ourselves the time and space to feel, to grieve, and to rediscover who we are outside of that relationship. Remember, it's not about erasing the past or pretending it didn't happen. It's about acknowledging its impact on our lives and using that as fuel for growth. I've learned to focus on what brings me joy, what fills my heart with love, rather than trying to fill the void left by someone else's absence. It's a delicate balance between forgiveness and accountability, but it's one we must find if we want to move forward. And when we do, we'll be surprised at how our lives begin to transform. We start to see ourselves as worthy of love, deserving of happiness, and capable of creating a new reality, one that's free from the trauma of what we've been through. As I look back on my journey, I'm reminded that rebuilding a life after trauma is possible. It's not easy, but it's worth it. The darkness of what we've been through can be overwhelming at times, but with time and support, we can find the light again. We can heal, we can grow, and we can create a new reality, one that's free from the pain of our past. If you're in this place right now, I want to leave you with hope. Hope that tomorrow will be brighter than today. And if you're not going through it yourself, know that you're not alone in supporting loved ones who are.